Recently, I've seen a number of deconversion stories where people have told of how they deconverted from Christianity to non-belief. And two particular users stand out, and one of them is McNuts, and the other is Voodoo 6. For those who don't know, which is probably not many, Voodoo 6's account was terminated recently, and his new account is also called Voodoo 6, but spelled differently. I'll put links to both of the accounts here. So do go and check them out and subscribe to them, if you haven't already. My own story is not so much one of deconversion, but because I've never been a theist, but I wouldn't have called myself an atheist either. I just didn't know a lot about whether religious claims were based on truth or not. So here's a brief description of my story. In 1995, at the age of 20, I had a job in forestry which involved moving away from the city where I grew up, away from most of my friends and family, for several months. Not having much of a social life, I found I had time to read and think. I stayed in a bedsit, and my landlady had 2 dogs. She was very busy with her work and family, so I used to walk them in the woods nearby. The dogs, not the family. Which suited her and me. Up to this point I knew virtually nothing about trees, but because of my work I needed to learn fast. I borrowed some books from the library and devoured them. I already liked trees, forests, plants, wildlife and the outdoors, but I discovered that trees are amazing things which became even more fascinating to me as I learned more about them. So soon, on my walks with the dogs, I was able to identify oak, ash, elm, birch, rowan, Scots pine, Douglas fir, larch, and many more. I learned that there are only 33 species of tree indigenous to Britain, and that our number 1 timber tree, the Sitka spruce, comes from the west coast of America. I also learned about photosynthesis, nutrients in the soil, and the animals and plants which live in the forest. For the first time in my life, I was studying something in detail which I had chosen to, and felt a new enthusiasm for acquiring knowledge which had been lacking at school. I watched a lot of wildlife documentaries and found David Attenborough's programs particularly good. I learned a lot about speciation, selective breeding, and the survival of the fittest, but didn't give much thought to evolution itself. I've never been religious, so this is not exactly a deconversion story, but I did fall into a number of traps along the way. I was fairly sure that there was some kind of spiritual dimension which our minds went to during dreams and after we died. I also thought that there must be a creative force or intelligence which guided us in some way, which I struggled to put my finger on. I sometimes have lucid dreams, and at this time I was convinced that I was seeing into this higher plane of existence. I knew very little about physics and cosmology, and had thoughts which I would now describe as anti-scientific. I thought that science was narrow-mindedly focusing too much attention on minute details whilst missing the bigger picture, and felt frustrated that there were more theories than known facts. I wanted answers to my questions about the afterlife, telepathy, levitation, UFOs and such like. My thoughts were that a framework of understanding was needed, something to clarify and focus one's inquiries and help answer the big questions in life. I had a lot of questions and wasn't prepared to accept explanations which I couldn't understand. The thing I didn't realize was that science itself held the key to understanding the world. I was already applying logic and reason and continually questioning my conclusions without it dawning on me till much later that that is exactly what good science does. For the next 11 years, I read a lot of non-fiction and watched documentaries, all the while learning, but not at the same pace as when I was 20. I changed jobs several times, met my first serious girlfriend, socialized more, and all the while felt like I was close, but never quite finding answers to my spiritual questions. I found religion fascinating and puzzling at the same time. I didn't believe it to be correct, at least not on a literal level, but I concluded that religious people had some kind of spiritual experience which had eluded me, and that they interpreted this as proof of their particular belief system. Embarrassingly, I didn't really understand what faith was until 2006 or so. After the 9/11 attacks, I got quite drawn into the whole inside job theory and read and watched Alex Jones, David Icke, and others. It seemed to me most likely that the official story was wrong, and although I looked for detailed debunking of the conspiracy theories, I struggled to find anything convincing. Perhaps I didn't look hard enough. One effect of becoming immersed in conspiracy theories is to become highly suspicious of authority and paranoid at the same time. The moon landing hoax theory was one I really looked into in detail. My interest in astronomy and space travel was growing, and I was discovering the conspiracy arguments crumbled one by one the more I learned about NASA and the history of the space program. I should mention some of my musical influences before I go too much further. Since I was a teenager, I loved Pink Floyd, and can still quote large chunks of The Wall, Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and Roger Waters' solo work. I also liked George Harrison and Johnny Cash. George Harrison was influenced by Hinduism and Buddhism to a degree, and his last album, Brainwashed, as well as having some amazing tunes, contained some lyrics which certainly reflected my thinking at the time.
Crippled by the boundaries, programmed into guilt, till your nervous system starts to tilt. In a room of mirrors, you can see for miles, but everything that's there is in disguise. Every word you've uttered and every thought you've had is all inside your files, the good and the bad.
The idea that something was watching us all the time and keeping notes remained with me until 2006. Johnny Cash was a strong Christian, but his music, the sound of it, his voice, Luther Perkins and Bob Wooten's guitar picking really stirred my emotions. It still does, even though I was never convinced by the religious stuff. Some of his songs, such as Were You There When They Crucified My Lord, I find hauntingly beautiful in a similar way to a film such as Lord of the Rings, or other works of fiction. He also spoke up for people such as Ira Hayes and John Henry, those who ended up on the wrong side of the law.
Call him drunken Ira Hayes, he won't answer anymore. Not the whiskey-drinking Indian nor the Marine that went to war.
It was mainly because of listening to Johnny Cash that I finally bought a guitar in 2003. I wish I'd got one as a kid. I might be quite good by now. Anyway, now we get to the point which clarified my thoughts to the extent that I would describe myself as an atheist or an agnostic atheist.